Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second installment of our first interview series on the podcast called Strategies for Letting Go of the Food and Weight Obsession. Today's topic is why willpower isn't enough for some of us with Dr. Marty Lerner. I'm so excited to do this interview because this man is very special to me. He pretty much came into my life and changed the game actually 14 years ago today. And today is the day I walked into your treatment center and my life just changed for the better. And I almost got choked up thinking about interviewing you earlier today. So, but let me give you his quick bio before we jump in because he is a man full of so much knowledge. You're going to want to know a ton. So, Dr. Lerner is he has a PhD and is the CEO of Milestones Eating Disorder Program in Hollywood, Florida. He's a graduate of NEV, Southeastern? Nova Southeastern University, a licensed and board certified clinical psychologist who has specialized in the treatment of eating disorders since 1980. He has appeared on numerous national television radio programs, including the NPR Report, 2020, Discovery Health, and ABC's Nightline, as well as authored several publications related to eating disorders in professional literature, national magazines, and newspapers, including USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Miami Herald, Orlando, and Hollywood Sun-Sentinel. His most recent publication is A Guide to Eating Disorder Recovery and is available via iBook and the Milestones website. So, Marty is someone that when I was in treatment, I could listen to for hours. So tune your ears in and you're going to learn some of kind of the good science and psychology stuff that, you know, the world is obviously not going to teach us about things like food addiction. And I'm so glad he's done so many of these shows because every time he does them, the world knows a little bit more about food addiction. So I guess, welcome, Marty.
Thank you very much. And thank you for a very flattering introduction.
You're very welcome. So why don't we, because some of my listeners probably, don't know that food addiction is possible.
Right.
So, or addressing it as an addiction. Do you want to jump in with that and kind of explain making the case for food addiction?
Yes, sure. I'd be happy to. Well, first off, I think semantics or our language doesn't do justice to try and describe what we're going to be talking about. So there's a lot of confusion, and the most obvious question most, I guess, non-food addicts or non-compulsive eaters or non-binge eaters and alike would ask is, how can food be addicting? And, again, going back to the paradox with language, it's sort of where drug addiction might have been years and years and years ago, because not all drugs are addictive. Well, not all foods are addictive. So for lack of better description, the words or phrase food addiction came into being because it tends to describe a relationship with food and dieting and weight and that whole umbrella under which all these different disorders kind of live. So I would just, suggest to whoever's listening that not to get hung up on the term food addiction, but look at this as one of a number of addictions or issues we have with either substances or compulsive behaviors that, despite our best intentions and willpower, don't seem to surrender to our intentions or our efforts. So another frame of reference with all that is food addiction is about being powerless over certain foods and our relationship with our eating patterns, just like alcoholism is about not having control, or in that vernacular, being powerless over alcohol when we ingest it, and drugs and compulsive gambling, and just all of those different buckets of different ways we self-medicate ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I put it in my notes too, but I often talk about the first time I ever talked to you. And you probably don't remember because you deal with so many people, but I just remember, I just wanted to fix my weight or fix the food. And I'll never forget you saying, so what have your consequences been with alcohol? And it was just this mind blown, whoa. you know,
right.
and that's kind of what you were just saying. So is that kind of and people don't even realize that, I guess you would say it's cross addictions where they could have
Yeah.
multiple things.
Well,
So,
the confusion really is that there's the nature of the behavior of the substance, be it alcohol or be it, fentanyl,
mhm,
or be it a behavior like gambling, and we can go down the whole list again, and sugar and flour, and so on, processed foods, and along those lines. The nature of the substance, but there's really the nature of the person.
yeah.
And, through the years, what I've observed is that most, not all, there are certainly exceptions to these rules, but for the most part, the nature of the person, whether they present themselves at a particular time in their life as having an addiction or a compulsion with eating in certain foods, or with a substance like alcohol or sedatives or what have you, that they uh, they tend to have this addictive component to their biology and their psyche, and their purpose for living, if you will.
Hmm.
And I think that leads me to conclude that when I'm talking with someone, and I don't remember the specific conversation, but with someone like yourself, I'm always on the lookout for getting a sense or an intuit about having other forms or substances with which someone, is not able to control with willpower.
Hmm. Yep.
And in your case, it was a double martini or something along those
Yeah.
lines.
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty much. Yeah. It's, and I think, and you probably know this, a lot of treatment centers don't treat. I mean, a lot of treatment centers just treat one. They don't address
Oh yeah, yeah. What ends up happening is because of lots of different reasons, we label someone to describe their illness.
Mhm,
So maybe we label someone as having cancer, or we label someone as being alcoholic, or we label someone as drug addicted, or we label someone, whatever. And what ends up happening is, if you use the medical analogy, cancer, well, is there one cancer? Maybe it originated in a lung, but by the time someone is being treated, they maybe be treated for, a tumor in their bone, or kidney cancer, or wherever it migrates.
mhm,
So if I make the same analogy, someone may start out as a compulsive overeater, the symptom of which may be obesity, or they may start out dieting, and the symptom of that for some people can end up being, an anorectic kind of illness. What ends up happening is they tend to, I like to say, switch chairs on the Titanic, thinking they're not going to drown. So with chemotherapy and the way we treat cancer, what ends up happening is we treat the lung cancer, and we may have reduced the tumor, but in many instances, it's migrated to another part of the body. And then we have to go and now treat the other part. Well, that person doesn't have control over that. There's a lot of processes that happen. Well, likewise, I would make the argument that someone may start out with, food addiction or compulsive overeating, or even alcoholism or whatever, and they either put down or migrate to another form of self-medication.
yeah.
So for the food addict, it might be, well, they have gastric bypass, and now they can't physiologically self-medicate by overeating. So they find that what was social drinking now manifests itself in compulsive drinking,
Mhm,
and so on and so forth.
mhm,
So back to the analogy, most people and institutions that treat these disorders are very narrow focused, or have been historically narrow focused. So they're treating a symptom, which might be the substance of use or the behavior of abuse, but not looking at the disease and the nature of the person being an addict or addictive personality, or having that genetic, physical, emotional, and spiritual malady. If
right.
they're not treating all three of those legs of those stools, then they're only treating a symptom. And I think that that's what you find both in medicine and psychiatry and in treating addictions.
Wow. And I think that's what's so key about, I mean, because I think I was set to go somewhere else and someone recommended your facility, and mainly because you had 12 step. And, I think that is such a important piece of it, where it's like you need that support group program for when you walk out of the place. And
Yeah,
I know not everybody chooses it. I know, because you hear people say, "Oh, treatment doesn't really work," and it's like, well, treatment isn't the fix. We need to learn to live the new lifestyle. But I have heard of people, a lot of people going to ones that don't use 12 step, and I'm grateful that you had us go to those meetings.
yeah, it's not an original
Yeah.
thought. Look, to be candid, what I do and what many people do who have letters after their name and their livelihood or their profession is, helping professions. Many in this field have a blend of personal experiences as well as professional experiences. And to tease out which are which is a little bit tricky, but it is a blend of what's evidence-based and what's experientially based.
Yep.
And I think that is a more potent formula than just an academic or intellectual understanding of something, because there are some components to recovery or a recovery lifestyle that have nothing to do with intellect,
Yes.
that have a lot to do with experience, but also have to do with finding your own path to spirituality and a connection with something more powerful than your own ego or self. And so that may take the form of something familiar to people in terms of their religious upbringing, or it may be a redefinition or a retooling of that and their own flavor of spirituality. But where all these paths tend to meet, in the end, is a connection with usually with a God of your understanding. And then the rest of that, can be left for people to decide for themselves, the different details of all of that.
Mhm.
But from a psychiatric or psychological perspective, my view of that is stepping out of the self or the ego and looking for the spirit within.
Yes.
And whether someone labels that the Christ within, or they label that, the Allah within, or the tree within, or whatever within, the more important thing is that they disassociate it from the ego of willpower or self.
Yep.
So my favorite expression along those lines is, your ego is not your amigo.
Oh, I remember that one. You had so many good one-liners. So that brings me to your other favorite piece, or the other thing I remember so much is Smurf, SMERF,
Right.
which is kind of what is it? Not a metaphor. What's
Well, and an acronym.
that's it?
Yeah, and there are three languages that I tend to speak, and there are languages that you tend to speak, and there's a language that may be your religious language.
Mhm.
There may be a language that is your native tongue, English. There may be a language in your profession. So in mine, I speak fluent insurance language. I speak fluent psychiatric psychological language, but I also speak fluent recovery.
Yep.
So, they're just different languages.
Yeah. Sure.
So in recovery language and in recovery experience in 12-step programs or programs that are akin to that, there are acronyms, a way of remembering things, just like we did in school. So I remember Roy G. Biv or something to
Yeah.
remember the primary colors.
Mhm.
So for me, the expression I had heard in attending, and yes, I have my own addictions that I've been recovering from for some years. So sitting in the chairs in these rooms and being educated, what was given to me was something called HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And those are elements that you want to avoid or address that lead people to being more prone to picking up a drink or an addictive substance or compulsive behavior. So I butchered that. I plead guilty with an explanation and made my own an acronym that worked for me, and it passed that along to people if they choose to try it. It's called SMERF. And SMERF is SMERF, spirituality, meditation, exercise, rest, which is balancing work and play, and a food plan, which for someone like myself or a compulsive eater or a food addict might be, whole food or a structured plan where you're avoiding processed junk foods, sugar, flour, that sort of thing. So I won't bore you with all the details of the food plan, but it is not a diet. It's just a healthy lifestyle in terms of eating.
Yes, I actually just interviewed Teresa yesterday for this, or two
Oh,
days ago for
good,
this series. So she gave a
good,
good, background on what the food plans are, and I love that it is not a diet. For me, it's like my freedom. It's like my roadmap
right.
for living that keeps me out of the food and in my life.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, absolutely.
and I think so many people think that if they just control the food with the diet, then that'll work, and it's like, nope, it won't. At least for some of us. And talking about those, I also remember when I was in treatment, I was a marathoner, and I remember
Right,
Nikki being like, "And we're not gonna run," and I was like, "What? I don't know how I'm gonna function." But
right.
I had to have my workout buddy, and I really began to understand what having an exercise addiction means, and that was really my purging. And I think some people don't really like. People think, "Oh, I worked out for 4 hours today. I'm doing great," and I'm like, that's a bit much. So I don't know if you want to maybe mention something about how
Yeah,
exercise can
sure.
be.
Well, we're also talking about a phenomenon called denial.
Yes.
Um, so
Yep.
sometimes you don't know you're addicted to something until you're in a position where you have to stop.
Yep. Yes.
But the other thing is you can take anything really that's healthy and push it to the point where it becomes unhealthy.
Hmm.
You can work and be an achiever, and that could be, followed with lots of accolades and achievements. But if you push that, you become, addicted to work or workaholic, and it's at the expense or consequences to the quality of your life. Exercise is a good example because with exercise, just like with dieting, to a point, really what dieting is trying to improve, your health and cosmetically to be more appealing. So, all right. But if you push that further, it becomes a disease and an illness that's lethal. And exercise in the service of health, moderating blood sugar, moderating stress. It's all good. Push it to, a high degree, it becomes both addictive. And the irony is that your set point or metabolism reaches a point where it's on survival mode, just like when you're restricting. So eventually you develop tolerance, meaning that you have to do more to achieve the same effect. So you have to eat less and less and less while you paint yourself in a corner to be able to not gain weight or to lose more weight. And you have to exercise more and more and more to stave off depression or the malaise of feeling like you're not doing enough. And then also you're burning all these calories, but you're not burning as much as you think, because what ends up happening is your body's conserving energy. So you could be running 2 hours and it would have been more effective to just run a half hour.
Wow. You should get up and say that at the beginning of every marathon.
Well, look, you can't say that everybody that drinks is alcoholic.
No, it's so
You
true.
can't, you can't say that every kid that has a candy bar, has to go to treatment.
Yeah, it's
And
so
you can't say that everybody that runs a marathon, has an exercise addiction.
mm,
So not all overweight people are food addicts or
yep,
compulsive overeaters.
yep.
Not all marathon runners are exercise addicts. However, if you were fishing, that would be the fishing hole I would go to catch one.
Exactly what I was thinking. It's not. I mean, I'm always amazed at people that aren't as addictive as it with it as I was.
Yeah,
But yeah, you
let's
know, you
go,
catch
let's go
something.
back to the nature of the person.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
So, a lot of people trade in their purging through making themselves sick or laxative abuse by purging through exercise because it's more socially acceptable
Yep.
and not as ego dystonic or oppositional to your value
Yep.
system or whatever.
Yeah.
So, it's
So
all the same beast.
yeah, it is. And that's why I love that you say that because it helps me look at every behavior and everything is okay, is this going to that level of I'm doing it a little too much? And,
Yeah, I don't want to turn off dog lovers, but I know that, where I live in South Florida, it's a bit much for me to see a baby carriage and I'm going to go say, oh, what a cute baby. And I look in, it's a little schnauzer in a baby carriage. I mean, I think, there's love addiction. There's,
oh, yeah.
there's anyway, so where you draw the line, could be subjective, but in my book, it's about the consequences.
Yeah.
So
And the dog's got a outfit on and a binky in its mouth.
right, yeah. I mean, I love my dog, but I'm not taking it out for a
Yeah,
walk in a baby carriage.
I got it. I got it. So that makes me want to dive more into that the neuroscience, the hypothalamus, and the.
Yeah.
I know you could go for hours on this, but again, it's another area I think a lot of people don't understand the serotonin and the dopamine and.
Yeah, 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 I can try and simplify this, but basically it used to be thought, as a matter of fact, in the original literature that was written by the original 100 men that started, notice I said men now, in AA, it's now 50% or more women. But
Mhm.
that said, this was in 1939, and then they had a Dr. Silkworth who worked with alcoholics, who was not an alcoholic, but described it as a disease, which we owe him a great debt for,
Mhm.
but also described it as an allergy. And we're now in 2022, and it was more recently, relatively speaking, that the technology caught up with what was written or experienced anecdotally recorded, and that is that we have PET scans, proton emission tomography, and we have functional MRIs that when you inject dye, you can map parts of the brain that have concentrations of certain neurochemicals. And there is a chemical, you won't remember this, but it's called dopamine, and that's the feel-good neurotransmitter. When someone ingests a lot of cocaine and they're running around, trying to sell matchbook covers and ice to Eskimos, what's really happening is they have a flood of dopamine in between their neurotransmitters or in these synapses, and they're high.
Mhm.
Okay. In a much, much, much more subtle, but still very potent way, there are certain people that either acquire or born with a propensity when they eat certain foods to have a very similar reaction to that. And what ends up happening in part is they secrete more dopamine than the average person. And the reward system of the brain, chemically speaking, learns this, just like there's muscle memory when you ride a bike. You can lay off the bike for 20 years, get on it, and in about 10 minutes, you're remembering how to ride a bike. Well, you can put down a substance that you've been addicted to, and if you pick it up, you'll have like muscle memory, and
Wow.
that will happen again because that's how you're hardwired. That said, what happens with certain trigger foods or amounts of foods is you'll have a reward reaction. And if you're depressed, it becomes like an antidepressant in the beginning. If you're nervous, it'll become a sedative, in a sense. The problem is you develop tolerance and you need more to get the same effect.
Mhm.
And then in the end, what's happening is you're doing it because you're not going to feel better, but without doing it, you'll go through withdrawal. So you're boxed in a corner where you have to do it in order to avoid feeling worse.
Right.
And that happens across the board with any addiction. So that's the neurochemistry of it. The hypothalamus is nothing more than a thermostat, a small part of the brain that's about the size of a quarter. And like a thermostat, it can go up or down in terms of your metabolism, but it also controls hormones and directs ghrelin in your stomach and leptin, in your fat tissue, and all these hormones to tell or signal you when you are hungry, or when to eat, what to eat, and when to stop eating. The problem is that the thermostat gets broken when you've abused it as much. It's like playing with the thermostat at home.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually you don't know which way is up and which way is down. So you're eating despite not being hungry,
Mm-hmm.
or the leptin creates a resistance and your brakes don't work as to when to stop eating, or the ghrelin is misinterpreted and it's really anxiety, it's not hunger, and you eat out of appetite, not out of physical need. So that whole orchestra works together, and when it's dysfunctional, you cannot depend on internal cues or intuitive sense of when to eat.
So true. I have noticed that if I'm in that, my blood sugar, it's like a roller coaster, and
Right.
I have, I'll have panic attacks, and it's like,
Yeah.
it's crazy how much, if you're choosing that food, how it can just set your blood sugar on a roller coaster.
Yeah, there's a whole, like I said, a whole orchestra. So it's not as important to understand it by connecting the dots and, being, a neuroendocrinologist, and all of that. You'll think yourself down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Um, the issue is to just know this stuff isn't good for you.
Hmm.
And that if I take a drink, my reaction to that is different than my, non-alcoholic, if you will, peers.
Yep.
So until you accept that you're physically and emotionally and spiritually different in some respects than someone who doesn't have that nature of the person, or doesn't have that particular, addiction or chemistry, you're going to be chasing your tail.
Yeah. And that brings me to the genetics piece. So, I have addiction all over, in my family, and thank God I also have recovery. But I don't. Are you the one that told me this? That genetic loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger, or did I?
Yeah, it's not an original
Yeah, I
expression,
didn't
but
think
that's
so.
true. There's a perfect storm that exists, and the perfect storm that's needed. It's like, oxygen and hydrogen. When you get two molecules of hydrogen and one, of oxygen, you make water. But separate, they're completely different things. Well, nature of the person, nature of the substance are two of the elements. The third is the environment or the setting of the circumstance. So, if I inherited a propensity towards addiction, let's say one or both of my parents had an alcohol use disorder or alcoholism, it doesn't mean I'm going to become an alcoholic. It does mean I have a vulnerability to that I inherited. However, if I'm in a circumstance where I'm drinking, binge drinking, let's say in college and whatnot, um, that may set the stage in an environmental sense, and now it's biological and it's environmental, and then the nature of the person, not the substance,
Mhm.
and all three combine to a perfect storm. I have the seeds of alcoholism. If I'm, dealing with an eating disorder, and a subset of that being food addiction or compulsive eating, overeating, or binge eating, or some variant of all that, overconsumption. What'll end up happening is that may lie dormant until a circumstance, stress, a divorce, or maybe the family moving at a young age, or adolescence, or onset of menses, or some sentinel event or milestone, excuse the pun, and now the circumstance or the setting, and the nature of the person, and now the nature of the substance, the food, takes on a new meaning.
Right.
So sometimes people will self-medicate with that substance,
Mhm.
but if they don't need the medication at a given point, it'll lie dormant.
Yep. Yep. And so they may it may never happen because they
Yeah. My daughter is a good example of that because she's in her 30s, but the truth of the matter is, yeah, she's had stressors in her life and she's had the right circumstances, but wasn't engaging in the particular behavior at that point in time.
Got it.
So the timing and the circumstance. So you have two things that cock the gun,
Yep.
but the third that didn't pull the trigger in your analogy. So, again, you can go down a rabbit hole trying to predict all of this.
Yeah.
The bottom takeaway is if your parents had an issue with obesity, then de facto there's a higher probability they had a food addiction issue, not necessarily, but a higher probability. And, you need to be careful. And likewise, if one or both parents had a drinking problem or a drug problem, you need to be careful. If they had a history of depression, you need to be, careful, and so on and so forth.
So then that's where, like, if you, like, when I came to treatment and you guys took away all those things I was escaping from, that's when it's like the trauma that I had as a child, it was there to start beginning revealed was my parents' divorce. And it's not like that was the one thing, but it was like, was at the event, I guess, that kind of tripped, because that's when I started to have that relationship with food and diet and all of
Right.
that just went together.
That was the onset.
Yeah.
So, right. So that was the trigger, if you will.
Okay.
The problem is that trauma doesn't have a language in the forefront of the brain. So there's the prefrontal cortex where a language is, or I call it the Mr. Spock area of the brain. It knows total logic, but no emotion.
Wow.
The amygdala is the back part of all of this. It's the reptile brain. It only knows two things. It knows how to go towards pleasure or get the hell out of Dodge when there's pain.
Mm-hmm.
And so what ends up happening is you step on a landmine. Your parents get divorced. Maybe you're 10, maybe you're 20, maybe you're 60. I don't know. And yeah, it's painful, but unbeknownst to you, you find, even though you're not aware of it, you're in less pain when you overeat, or you're in less pain when you're drinking, or you're in less pain when you're acting out in a relationship, or you're in less pain when you divert your emotions and distract yourself with work, and so on. But what happens is the prefrontal cortex forgets this. And so whenever you're triggered, and you won't realize what's triggering you, you'll just start to overeat. And then the overeating takes on a life of its own. Now you're not just overeating because you're upset, you're overeating, for any reason.
Yep.
So it becomes its own illness. Although it started as a symptom, now it's its own illness, just like the cancer migrated from the lung to the bone. And so now you have to deal with the illness, so you stop overeating. But if you don't deal with the trauma, maybe you'll go a month, maybe you'll go a week, maybe you go a year. You get into a relationship, you get into an argument with your significant other, you're off to the refrigerator. Why? Because your amygdala says, holy whatever, and then it goes to the food because that's the default to cope with that. But you're not conscious of that unless you've done the work to undo the trauma, so that you bring it frontal, and then you learn to identify it and see it for what it is, so you don't have to self-medicate. That's an oversimplistic explanation of trauma. There are many ways to get there, but you're not going to get there through talk and intellect.
Yes. So that makes so much sense. But do you think that's why it's like, because when you talk about trauma, it's like people, it's like they don't realize, like, oh, that was actually, like, people think, oh, I'm not unique, it happened to tons of other people.
Right.
And they kind of just brush it off. So
Right.
is that, maybe that's because they're still like, because I always see it as, until you address that root event, you're constantly responding the same way out of that original, you're reacting.
Or you develop other means of self-medicating that are harm reduction or less with less consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say, I'll be real quick about this. Let's say I had a trauma like yours, parents divorced at 10.
Mhm.
I developed a food addiction or compulsive overeating. I get to high school and I get a crush on somebody. We won't go into that. Um, and so I stop using food or abusing food, but I start like everybody, smoking some
Yep.
marijuana, and maybe I take a pill or two or whatever. And so, not that one's, less destructive than another, but I start a different form of self-medicating. Then I run into a problem with that. And then, I'm doing something else, and then I'm doing something else. And it's like a triangle that goes down, and the further down the triangle, maybe the less harmful. And maybe I'm using a 12-step program. I see this all the time as someone who participates in it. You put down one addiction, the next one takes center stage.
Mhm.
And usually it's under the umbrella of codependency or relationships.
Mhm.
So what ends up happening, it could be cigarette smoking, it could be work, it could be what they call codependency, it could be a relationship issue, but untreated, you just keep switching chairs on the Titanic. It's just that the ship is going down slower.
Mhm.
Um, it doesn't mean you can't stop using alcohol or drugs or food. It just means that in order to resolve the nature of the person being an addict and all the different things that come with it, you do have to look for root cause.
Yeah.
But you don't have to solve the trauma,
Yeah.
so to speak, in order to stop drinking. That would be a
Right. Well, that's
mistake.
good. That is a very good point. Um, so actually, talk since I've read probably 6 books on codependency, but maybe and I still have my old ripped up melody beady language of
Right.
letting go devotional, but
Yeah, don't
maybe
we all?
yeah, right. Maybe expand on the codependency where some people
Yeah, codependency is one of those terms that has a lot of meaning. It's
yes.
like, it gets very confusing. It simply means, some kind of dependence on people, usually outside of yourself, not a higher power, but people other than yourself for either validation
Mhm.
or having more control or influence over how you feel about yourself or your emotional temperature than you would like
Mhm.
or realize. So I'll give you an example. I just can't explain it academically, but I have a group of guys. We meet at my house. We met last night, every Wednesday night. It's about 7 guys. And we read from a textbook or a book called The Courage to Change.
Mhm.
And, it's one of many books about relationships and codependency and just kind of self-help and whatnot. But it's not written in a language that's psychiatric nomenclature or whatever. It's very based on good experiences from people. Okay.
Mhm.
Codependency is our getting comfortable when we put down all the forms of self-medication. Codependency is usually the umbrella under which we are uncomfortable in our own skin and in our own skins. So in order for us to heal, and now that we're not using the symptom we're treating the disease with, like alcohol or food or whatever, now we're getting into how we think and perceive other people or become dependent
Mhm.
on other people telling us whether we're good, bad, worthy, ugly, attractive, competent, incompetent, etc.
Mhm.
Almost all people, I don't think people with addictions have a monopoly on this, have some sense or paradox between being either better than or less than,
Mhm.
or in the language of recovery speak, egomaniacs with inferiority
Very complex.
complexes.
Yep.
So anyway, so this group of guys have gotten to a point where we're all just being ourselves.
Mhm.
Doesn't matter what we have, what we do for a living, where we went to school, or any of that stuff. But when you read something or you talk about something, what we're really discussing are different elements in our relationships with either wives, past, present, or future, friends, employers, with each other, etc. And we're getting honest feedback from each other, which allows us to see ourselves through our own eyes and be less dependent in the end on trying to see ourselves on what we either want or think other people are seeing us as.
That's awesome.
The symptom relief from that is not feeling socially anxious
Mm-hmm.
and feeling as good as rather than better or less than.
Mm-hmm.
In spirituality terms, I define it as humility.
Mm-hmm.
It means that you and I aren't different.
Right.
We're packaged differently, but if you really look at spirituality as I experience it, it's really the idea that we're all basically the same and we all basically want the same things. It's just that some of us have learned different ways in which to either manipulate or get that.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, codependency means that that more of me is defined by me than by you.
That makes sense. And life is really all about relationships, but we don't know that when we're knee deep in our addictions, because our addiction is our best friend, and it totally, what is it? The enemy wants to get you alone and kill you. And,
Right.
that is why the support element of recovery is so important.
Well, isolation is the
Yeah.
key mark of any addiction.
Mm-hmm.
So, look, there are 3 stages, right? And the first stage, the stuff works, alcohol, food, and whatnot. You feel better. There aren't that many consequences. Hey, I found Burger King. You can have your way, and and anyway, second stage, it's not working as well, but you're living in the illusion that you can get back to the first stage,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still worth doing.
Mm-hmm.
The last stage is terrible because it's not working at all, but it's staving off the consequences of not doing it.
Yeah.
So that's a horrible place to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that's usually where isolation takes place because you don't want people to interrupt your drinking.
Mm-hmm.
So you drink alone, even though you've been out socially or have drinks before you go out, but usually you end up drinking alone.
Mm-hmm.
You end up eating alone. There isn't a lot of places where you can socially binge unless it's a buffet, and then you have to kind of hide it, or purge or etc. And we can go on and on. When you're gambling, you're not going, and you're gambling, milk money for your family or whatever. It's isolating.
Yeah.
What I found in recovery is you've reversed those chapters. You start getting involved in recovery, and in the first stage, you're feeling better. And there's this honeymoon phase, and it's nice because you feel such a relief from the consequences, immediate consequences of overeating, purging, and whatnot. But the middle stage, it loses some of its luster, and now you're starting to feel feelings. So the good news is you get to feel your feelings. The bad news is you get to feel your feelings.
Yep.
Third stage, you get to a point where you want to get. And that is you feel better going to meetings and doing recovery and doing steps or doing the deal or doing, a healthy life. And it feels much better than not doing it. And when you don't do it, you don't feel well. And when you are doing recovery, you feel better.
Mm-hmm.
But it's anti-isolation. What's really happening is that there's more and more people of like mind that are the herd is around the water hole.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found over time is that we're very much like zebras in recovery. The zebras that live the longest, when they do studies, this is a fact, are the ones that stay in the middle of the herd. They don't gravitate to the outskirts of the herd because the ones that get picked off by the lions, which is the addiction, are the ones that are on the periphery of the herd. The ones that stay in the center live the longest.
They're solid.
And that's very true in recovery, whether your recovery is in a church, it's in an AA room, an OA room, or wherever that happens to be of like-minded people who are in the same struggle you are.
Yep.
And you need to stay in the middle of that herd and drink from the water hole and don't venture out because you'll definitely get picked off.
Yeah, that someone used to say to me, stick with the winners, stay away from the bottom feeders.
Yeah, all the same principle.
Yep.
But you got to get comfortable around people
Yes.
and to get comfortable and feel as good as you need to do the work.
Yes, yeah, it's not a quick fix or an automatic. And that brings up one more question: is what do you think? And I thought of this with COVID. Do you think that the addictions have just exploded out of the isolation with COVID?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a statistic.
I was
My
wondering.
guess is that Zoom has helped more than it's hindered,
Oh, good.
as a band-aid to all of that. And that the silver lining in that is that it will probably stay, but not as a substitute for interaction and, in group therapies and meetings and all of that good stuff, but as an alternative and an add-on for people.
Mhm.
That said, I think when people isolate and they have the nature of the person having addictive tendencies, they're more prone to overindulging in, whatever fixes their loneliness,
Yeah.
which is painful.
Mhm.
So again, we're back to isolation. But if they're interacting, it may be a salve to ease that discomfort. But yeah, if I were in China and I were forced to be,
Oh,
in an apartment and all that, I'd be doing more than, banging on pots and pans. I'd be out of my mind.
yep.
So, human beings are meant to be around other human beings,
Hmm.
despite there's sometimes discomfort and ill feelings about that. It's a basic human need. That's why it's cruel and unusual punishment to take a prisoner and isolate them.
Mm, yeah.
So as much as you want to be by yourself at times, trust me, there's a difference between solitude and loneliness.
Oh, I
So
I can just feel the me alone before recovery and me alone after, or so
yeah, sure.
it's
Yeah,
so
and it's
different.
one of those things you may not realize
Yeah.
because, again, that amygdala part of your brain wants you to move away from pain. So you might isolate, but then, what ends up happening is it tends to cause more pain.
Hmm. Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
I'm grateful that now if I know that I enjoy being by myself, which was so hard to do without eating or drinking before because I was so uncomfortable in my skin. So,
right,
um, so
sure.
I think all of these things are kind of evidence of why just willpower isn't enough and why so many of us have needed treatment. um,
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to say anything else about willpower, but
Yeah, well, the only thing I would say, is again, it's a language issue sometimes. To me, it's not about a discipline. The discipline is doing the things that you don't have to rely on willpower or your ego or yourself um, to deny yourself a substance. It's
hmm.
not about that. It's about no longer wanting it or needing it. There's
Hmm.
a difference between I like something and I need something.
Hmm.
People that don't have a drinking problem, they may like a martini or whatever, or a glass of wine,
Hmm.
but we think we may like it. But if you have an addiction, it's that you need it.
Yep.
So it's a little bit different than that. Um, but what I would say is that the solution that seems to work is not, not in only the medical or biological side, and not only the psychiatric or emotional side, although those are important. I go back to this third leg of the stool, and that is you're much better off relying on some source of energy, power, or belief in something other than yourself.
Hmm.
And when a group of people get together, the aggregate of those people, like a prayer circle or an AA meeting or whatnot, that's a very powerful source that you're not going to be able to measure with your five senses.
Right.
So it's important, that you avail yourself of plugging into a power source that's not just between your ears.
Love that. So essentially, you're kind of saying spirituality is kind of the essential piece of lasting recovery.
Right, and that you have to define what that is for you,
Hmm.
and that that there's enough tolerance for most people
Hmm.
that will allow you to define that, it doesn't mean it's devoid of some religious rituals or beliefs. It can be inclusive of that or exclusive of that.
Hmm.
But what I would say about spirituality is no one is necessarily dictating
Yeah.
what the rules of that are for you or what that should be. So it leaves you with the challenge of evolving that for yourself. And so it's necessarily ambiguous because no one's defining it for you.
Hmm. Hmm. That makes total sense. Yeah, I often say I would not have been able to do it if it was a program of religion. I needed to be able to return to that relationship.
Well, because most people grew up, regardless of their religious affiliation as a child, with fixed notions and experiences in what they experience as religious dogma.
Mm,
So
yeah.
when people first get into a 12-step program or another recovery program or what have you, they learn, again, this isn't original, that religion is for people that don't want to go to hell, and spirituality is for people that have been there.
Uh-huh.
Um, Now, there are a lot of people that develop their flavor of spirituality and then reconnect with their church of their childhood, but now reconnect with it in a completely different way, where the rituals have meaning
Mhm.
and the symbols, if you will, and the texts that they read have a completely different take on it.
Mhm.
So, the religion of your childhood is not the religion of your recovery.
Nope, absolutely not. And that's a whole other topic that we could do another time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. There is no one way or the highway,
Hmm.
you know. So, but you could tell one thing about everybody that has connected, to that power, and that's that they're usually good people.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Simple, simple but true.
yeah,
All right. Well, wow, we covered a lot. So thank you so much, Mark.
sure, sure. Enjoy doing
And
it.
I'll wrap up now, and I'll see you guys all next week. All right. Well, you take care of yourself, and I'll get this to you when it's done.
Okay, great.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, Marty. Bye.